Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host, Wilfred Riley. We normally have some other guests on joining us, but I guess they're probably off watching Trump accept the nomination because we are recorded on Thursday night. But I'm sure we can watch it, record it, and watch what's happening. And our wonderful guest this week is Elizabeth Weiss. She is a physical anthropologist and the author of On the Warpath, My Battle with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's good to have you. I got your book. I enjoyed it. There was one overarching scary piece, which we'll get to, but why don't we talk about, you tell us about the book. Obviously, a lot of it's covering what you do, but also being canceled and why you felt it was important to tell your story.
Well, I'm a physical anthropologist, as you say, and I study skeletal remains. And I love that part of my job. It's a part that I've always loved because I love anatomy and I love what bones can tell us. They can help us reconstruct the past. They can help forensic anthropologists identify homicide victims, and it has bridges into medical research as well. So throughout my years as a professor at San Jose State University, I had a job that combined teaching and research and curation of one of the largest skeletal collections west of the Mississippi, the Ryan Mound. And the Ryan Mound is a pre-contact, so before any Europeans contacted these people, collection of Native Americans in California. And throughout this time, I spent my years researching this collection. But I've also been very concerned about the laws such as the national law, the Native American Graves Protection, the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and the California one, NAGPRA, so NAGPRA and NAGPRA, and how those laws are making it more difficult to study skeletal remains, especially Native American skeletal remains, and because they're reburying these bones. And so I've been talking about the problem of reburial for years. And in 2020, I wrote a book co-authored with Jim Springer, who's a now retired attorney, called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. And that book basically argues that reburial laws like NAGPRA are part of a postmodern agenda where the reason to bury bones is basically linked to a narrative of victimhood, but with modern Native Americans being the victims and saying we have links to these ancestral bones, even when there's no true evidence of the link. But because it's a postmodern agenda, it basically doesn't matter if there's any real evidence for the link. It matters who tells the story. So basically, at the point of publishing this, the huge cancel culture campaign came after me, including an open letter calling for the publishers to withdraw the book with about 900 signatures. And then a domino effect of cancellations happened, including when I posted a photo of me holding a skull that said, "I'm so happy to be back with old friends," posted it on Twitter after we came back from like over a year away from the collection due to COVID restrictions that closed the campus. This led to the university decrying that the photo was disgusting, even though previously they had no problem with such photos, even asking me to come in to take photos like that for promotional purposes, and basically locked me out of the facility where the remains are. This also then led to a deplatforming at the Society for American Archaeology. And eventually, I had to sue my university to ensure that I wasn't going to get fired. The last point of cancellation that I experienced actually just happened last year in about October 2023, when the American Anthropological Association decided to remove me from their program because I said that you can tell the difference between a male and a female skeleton. Once again, it's a postmodern agenda that's arguing that the victim's narrative, regardless of how valid it is, needs to be listened to and heeded to and obeyed rather than the truth. And in that case, the victim narrative is the trans community. So when that cancellation happened, I knew I had to write this book to show how this kind of esoteric issue of reburying ancient remains is actually tied to the greater issue of identity politics.
So I wanted to ask one follow-up, then I'm gonna let Will, talk about the connection to everything else that's going on, how it's not isolated to just you. But I mentioned earlier that as I was reading the book, there was one kind of, overarching thing that was really concerning to me. And I'm sure that most people who watch and listen to this and will can attest to why this is a problem, but it'd be good having you in that position to talk about that. And that is, you gave a couple examples in the book. You can use those or others, but the importance of the work you do and how it helps from a health standpoint, crime, history, anthropology, all the positive things you can learn from skeletal remains. And the reason that's important is because this is a hard science. This is the scary part. People first used to ignore this 3, 4, 5 years ago. A little less so now because you can't. But a lot of the people don't take it seriously because they think that's just the social sciences, right? That's all gender studies. That's, postmodernism. That's your English class. That kind of stuff. But it's not really getting into, I know we talked to Heather McDonald about what's happening in medical school and other areas. But up until her and a couple other people, everybody just kind of blew it off. It's like, yeah, that's what you get when you major in those types of studies. But it's different for this. And so you had a firsthand experience of how it didn't matter how serious or how esoteric or how scientific the work is, they're still doing the same thing. So that's what I really thought that was most concerning, and talk about how that's hurting, what that does to the research that you do and how it's limiting the things that we could find out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point because a lot of people hear anthropology and they immediately think of cultural anthropology and the social sciences. But physical anthropology and what we call bioarchaeology, which is the study of skeletal remains in the archaeological record, are hard sciences. They incorporate chemistry, they include DNA research, for example, but they also are not just academic fields from the position of, oh, this is interesting to learn about the past. They have real life implications. And what some people don't realize is that anthropologists are one of the top group of people who teach doctors, medical doctors, about anatomy. So when you can't get a job in anthropology as a physical anthropologist, you might go to a medical school and teach anatomy. And so we want these people to have a great understanding of sex differences, for example, age differences. And you cannot do that if you don't look at the biology of the bones. Previous research that I have done has looked at connections between past diseases and present diseases. For example, arthritis patterns have changed over time, that we know now that although arthritis is kind of in almost every population, in the past, most people who got arthritis were younger than now, but they had it in their upper arm bones, so their shoulder and their elbow, and less so in their hands and their wrists, and even less so in their legs, like knees, ankles, and hips. And we know now that one of the reasons why this has reversed in modern age is that we're putting too much weight on our lower joints, and this is increasing the risk of arthritis.
Is that
And
because we're fat?
yes.
No, just checking. I'll say it so you don't have to. It's because we're fat. Go on.
And so basically, this is something that anthropologists have documented before medical doctors even. As well, we know bone biology in a way that that medical doctors sometimes don't know about because we have the long picture. So, for example, there's been concerns by the medical community about what breastfeeding and having many children does to bones of women. And we know from looking at many populations over time that women who have many children and who breastfeed and who have a good nutrition, they actually have better bones than the women who didn't breastfeed or women who didn't have children. So this is kind of the human story that's being told. And then if we look at how this affects things like forensics, anthropologists look at differences in the skull and in the other bones to identify whether somebody is perhaps Hispanic versus Native American. And there's research on collections that are looking at differences in the skull to figure this out, due to the fact that sometimes we'll have bodies found in the desert and trying to figure out whether these are people who died crossing, a year ago, or are ancient remains. This is real life impact that it has, bringing justice to those who have died and to their families, but also understanding what consequences our modern life has, and teaching the next generation of forensic anthropologists and doctors.
Well, that was a great summary of why it's important. Will, what are your thoughts on this, the crazy law, or again, cancel culture, finding a way to take people down for no reason?
I mean, as an academic as well as a consultant, I think this is crazy bullshit. I mean, it's not at all surprising to hear, though. I mean, like, anthropology actually is one of these fields that I'm amazed hasn't been attacked like this before, at least on scale. Because a lot of things that anthropologists say get into the reality of the fact that there are different human sexes, or in any real sense, different human races, so on down the line. So, as I understand, you can usually tell someone's ethnic background by, for example, looking at their skull if you find a body. And until these were scrubbed from the internet, frankly, a couple of years ago, there were these fascinating articles on how to do this that I would sometimes assign to my criminal justice classes. And looking at them, you really knew that sort of the Nicole Hannah Jones wing of the academy was going to come after this sooner or later. So, I mean, I actually have a question here in terms of just the hard practical reality of this. So, I mean, for Dr. Weiss, like when you say people are arguing that you can't tell the sex of human skeletons, I mean, I've seen local cops do that. Like, would you mind explaining to the audience how you can do this, by the way? Because my understanding is that that's not something that was really questioned.
Yeah, it absolutely isn't questioned if from the scientific perspective, no matter what the ideologues will tell you. I could sit anyone down and teach them how to do this on a whole skeleton. Basically, what you're looking at is two main areas of the body. If you have the whole skeleton, you look at the pelvis. There are clear differences between males and females, and the pelvis. The angle of the pelvis, angle of the birth canal. We have a sciatic notch
This is
that
pretty
is
female specific, I'd imagine.
very specific. And then also the skull. The skull is very different between males and females, but the whole skeleton has differences between males and females, in part because what happens in males is the hormones that drive male bone rebuilding, repair and rebuilding and remodeling throughout life. Basically, put bone on the outside of the bones, so like on the outer perimeter of the long bones, and cause the robusticity or the bigness. Whereas with the females, most of the remodeling and rebuilding goes on the inside next to the bone marrow. And so you get this more gracile or delicate skeleton. So these are important things to know because sometimes you won't find a pelvis. Sometimes you'll just find a femur, and you can still, with about 85 to 90% accuracy, say whether it's a male or female. Nowadays, we can even look at the DNA from bones and get even more accuracy. But you don't want to just depend on DNA for a couple reasons. One thing is it's more expensive. Second thing is, if you want to make, if there's a crime that's occurred and you find a body, you want to make the decision as quickly as possible. You don't want to waste any time. You can get a second backup DNA test to try to determine for sure. But in one way, if you're 98.9% sure that this skeleton is a female from the bone, that is already cuts out 50% of the population that you have to look for when you're looking at missing people, for example, right? But the other thing is, if you don't determine if the body belongs to a male or female, you might have difficulty determining the age because fusion patterns different between males and females, and that's another issue. We've been so good at basically identifying male and female with a whole skeleton, that this is probably one of the things that we're almost 100% at now. It On the flip side, if you look at very old individuals and you have the skull and the pelvis, the skull of a female may look much more masculine because of postmenopausal, but the pelvis will still tell you it's a female. So then you can determine about the age of the individual with just the skull and the pelvis. So these are fascinating things and really help to, answer questions about who the victim is. And throwing that out does so much harm in these cases.
But I mean, I would imagine that if you found a skeleton of someone that seemed to be purely Amerindian or American Indian with no Hispanic admixture or whatever the proper term would be, that seemed to have been there for quite a while, that would imply that this wasn't a recent murder victim.
Yes.
The implications are pretty obvious. I guess a follow-up sort of wonky question. I'm interested in this almost strategically. How do people confuse this? Like, how is this made to seem complex? Because most of the better discoveries in the hard social sciences are pretty clear. Like, if you have, more warring factions in a country, war is more likely or something like that. Can you guys hear me, by the way?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay, yeah, that a weird. We've had some tech issues here. Okay, but so like, how is this made to seem complicated? Like, if you say, well, women have a vagina and give birth to babies, so their pelvis looks different. This
And
seems like
transmit.
something. Well, that's. I think that we're gonna get into like how the bullshit happens here. But like, so
So
how is that made to seem complicated? Like the people with the pelvis that indicate that they once had a vagina are women. I mean, when you say 99% accuracy, that sounds about right because you could be missing bones or something.
yeah.
How does that seem? How's that made to seem complex?
So I think they make it seem complex in a couple ways. One thing is in the archaeological record, what they'll do is they'll argue that if you find a skeleton that is, or bones with artifacts that are not clearly linked to the same sex that the bone is, then they'll say, oh, well, maybe that was, yes, this is a female skeleton, but it has what we think are male artifacts. So it must be a trans individual.
Now, can you explain it? Because I want to make sure people understand. You're basically saying you find I'm a simplify. I'm not a PhD
woman
like
with a
you are.
spear or
You
something.
find a female bone, but it's next to a spearhead. So you say, well, it must have been a dude.
Yes. Or
She's going to
trans.
respond. Just as a quick comment, like this is one of my issues. Like I certainly don't identify as a male feminist because I'm not a huge creep. Comes the punchline, but I mean, like there's a huge amount of sexism to all the gender stuff. So like we now know that like some small but real percentage of warriors historically were women, which makes sense. So if you find a woman with a spear, like my first reaction would be, oh, that's a badass woman. That's cool. The reaction now seems to be, no, that woman was actually a man. Take your
Yeah.
dated shield maiden nonsense out of here. So, I mean, that's just a comment there. But the Joan of Arc, for example, recently came up for transing, and it's interesting to see this happen with sort of, Athabascan warriors from 2,000 years ago. So,
Right.
Yes. And so how I see it is that basically they have reversed the independent variable and the dependent variable. So the independent variable has to be sex. It's
Right.
determined biologically. It's not going to change. And the dependent variable is the artifact because that can differ between one culture and another.
Mhm.
So, there's many possibilities. It could be that some females were warriors. It could be that males sometimes buried their beloved with their favorite
Something to
sword.
remember me by.
Exactly. There's many possibilities. But that is definitely one of the ways that
Right.
they get this confused. Then the other way is anthropologists have what we call a 5-scale system for sex determination. And it's male, probable male, undetermined, probable female, and female. And so some people have said this is because of the sex spectrum, but it's not because of the sex spectrum. It's because sometimes you don't have the whole skeleton. So you can't, so you're like, oh, this is a probable female or probable male. Other times, you might have an individual who has almost everything, but not an identifying feature like the pelvis. So you might not be that good at identifying it. Some people are going to be better than others. So the probability lies in a lack of data or a lack of skills, not a sex spectrum. But they're trying to turn that into a sex spectrum, which is really just wrong. The other thing is that there are a few pathologies or a few diseases that are disorders of sexual development. These are DSDs. And anthropologists are now trying to argue that this is like the sex spectrum, but it's not. If you are a XYY or XXY, a Klinefelter or a Turner syndrome individual, this is a disease. These people are almost always not able to have children or to make someone pregnant. And therefore, this should not be viewed as just a variation. It's interesting, actually, that anthropologists can identify these diseases in the bones and say, well, this person had Klinefelter syndrome, because in a sense, the abnormal sex chromosome um, part of the disease also affects all sorts of other things, and we can identify that. That doesn't mean it's on the spectrum any more so than some people have 6 fingers, and we wouldn't say, oh, well, the average hand, it's normal to have anywhere from 4 to 6 fingers, right? Some people have 6 fingers. It's called polydactyly, and it's a disease. It's not normal. And I think that some people think that it's mean to say something is a disease or not normal or abnormal, but it's not mean. It's just a description. And so, in a sense, that's another one of where they've gone astray. Now, I think that some of the reason why they've gone astray in these ways is because we have what we call queer archaeology or queer anthropology, and people who are not identifying as their biological sex, whether, they're trying to see themselves in the past or themselves in others. And I think that that's a really sad thing about um, this whole movement in anthropology, because anthropology really is about learning about the other. You're not supposed to look, take your own rose-colored glasses and look to see if you can find yourself in the remains. You're supposed to see, what were these people's lives really like? Who really was this victim? Not, is that victim like me, or was this past person like me? And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's gone off the rails.
Well, I want to follow up with something that Will said, but first I got to ask, a question, an educational question, since you say that a lot of people in your field teach doctors and you understand the anatomy. It's been a while for me. So you mentioned the femur. That's the upper leg, right?
Yes.
Yes, I got the bone answer right. Check. Now, my follow-up question was, oh, I didn't hear you, Will. Now I lost you.
I don't.
I can't.
I cannot hear him either.
He made a little funny comment making fun of me. Good. I'm glad we couldn't hear it. But my follow-up question was going to be, early on when Will first spoke, he talked about, I'm surprised this hasn't happened in anthropology sooner, right? And that's funny because you make a point both in the book and when we first met that you're not saying or writing anything you hadn't always said. So, like, I think when you talked about the book in 2020, I'm laughing. You just happened to write it at the wrong time, right? If you wrote that book in 2018, you'd be fine. It was something about that. So, talk about that. How you haven't changed. Nothing that you get canceled for was anything new for you, but all of a sudden, you just happened to say it at the wrong time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because, Repatriation and Erasing the Past came out in 2020. I had written another book on that same topic, and I believe back in 2008. I had published on issues of reburial even beforehand in 2004. I think one of my earliest articles was called Kennewick Man's Funeral, and Kennewick Man is a famous Paleo-Indian dated to about 8,000 to 9,000 years old, found in Kennewick, Washington, who was big controversy over him about whether he should be reburied or not. And the thing is that there were always, throughout my career and earlier, like if I'm talking about starting off, I got my bachelor's in 1996. There were always people who were very much what we would have then called politically correct and who had some of these ideas. I don't think I ever saw any of the trans issue back then, but some of the other issues, such as pro-reburial issues. But there was an agreement that there was a debate to be had. And so people were debating about it. And, same with the issue of, how real is race, differences in the skeleton, and so forth. So there was disagreement, but there was not really the cancellation that we see now. And so when I was writing Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which I started writing probably towards the end of 2017, I thought, you know what, when this book comes out, it's just going to be like one of those books that sits in the library shelf. Once in a while, somebody will quote it, and that. And so I was shocked that this cancellation campaign occurred. And I think that some of the reasons why, it was like, quote unquote, the wrong time. And in some ways it was the right time because, and being ignored is even worse, right? Having nobody read it is even worse than having it be controversial. But I think that there were certain things that made the change the field to be more cancel culture, as opposed to just politically correct. And I think that some of that is that we were at home, not in person. It is so much easier to be mean to people if you're not face to face to them. I think the COVID issue, even though that was, started in late 2019, right? So I think that did have an effect on cancel culture in that sense. I think, of course, certain of the political events, the election of Trump was a huge issue in San Jose State University, with students in tears, classes being canceled. And then the George Floyd case and the trial, I guess first the case and the protests, and then the trial, all of this ramped up this kind of cancel culture activism. And we get this movement from the university being kind of dispersed, much of the already woke narrative being in there, but accepting that some people aren't going to buy into it. To you, if you don't buy into it, you are a quote unquote white supremacist, regardless of your skin color, So I think that that's how I see the events and the timing.
Right. I had one last question, then I want to get into the NAGPRA law and talk about that. But you mentioned that I think it's specifically the Rhine Mound collection, but you talked about a lot of your research being on skeletons that were found, before the white man came and messed everything up. So that's interesting because some of the skeletons have evidence of violence that had happened in that group of the collections to that individual. And my good friend Dr. Riley has a chapter in his latest book about the myth of peaceful native people. And I like to give you time to dispel his argument and tell everybody that you found no evidence of violence in the skeleton. And
Most
Wilford Riley's
peaceful
completely
people that have ever
wrong.
lived. All
Wilford
day was
Riley's
spinning,
completely
dancing, and
wrong.
making love.
And Native just that made love, music, and watched Oprah all day. Tell him where he's wrong.
Yes, unfortunately, I cannot do that. The Ryan Mound collection, it spans, I think, about 2,500 years, but the whole collection is pre-contact. And yet we have clear evidence that there was invasions from other tribes, um, things like bumps on the head, broken noses, embedded arrowheads. This is very common. And one of the things we see is that when we're looking at the patterns of violence, it's almost always, if a female is injured, she was hit on the back of the head. But if it's a male, they were hit front to front. So there's this kind of image of, the females being attacked, not being the aggressors, but the males aggressive towards each other. And I always say, fortunately, in this collection, there's hardly any violence towards children. That's, so that's not always the case. We've seen child sacrifices, of course, with the Aztecs, with in the Incas. And so, it's not always that children are protected. I think that, humans are capable of much love, but they are all also capable of much violence. And it is ridiculous to assume that these populations had no evidence of violence or very little evidence of violence compared to all the other populations in the world. One of the interesting things is if you look at the Paleo Indians, these are the oldest finds in the Americas, like the Kennewick Man. Almost all of them have some evidence of injuries that were likely caused by aggressive attacks, including Kennewick Man, who was initially thought to be a homicide victim because he didn't look Native American. And then when they were taking the x-rays, they found an obsidian point, so an arrowhead embedded in his pelvic bone. So he was shot, but 9,000 years ago.
Well,
Yeah,
I guess
if
I got to
if I
give
can actually jump
Will a
in with
chance to defend
no, I
himself.
mean, well, yeah, like I don't think there's really a serious debate about whether Native American. Well, actually, one of the reasons I included that chapter in the book, and the chapter is actually titled something like "Indians didn't spend all day laying around, writing poetry and making love," and it's actually gotten a lot of backlash from reviewers, some half sardonic. But like the reason I included that is that it's pretty obvious if you actually read through the literature that human societies have always been pretty violent, and the more quote unquote barbaric they were, the more violent, I would say, overall. And I mean, there's a weird tradition in anthropology of kind of trying to define everyone as peaceful until you find out reality, and then you can't anymore. And this would be more cultural anthropology, but there's a book called Constant Battles, which is another book I'd recommend that has just a hilarious chapter on this, with me reading it from kind of a male-coded, cynical perspective. But I mean, so like the ancient Maya, we didn't decipher their writing for quite a while. So people, especially feminists, kept insisting that the society was a peaceful matriarchy. And when they actually decoded the language, it turned out that about a third of the words related to war. So, like, one of the most common glyphs or whatever that they kept seeing, which they thought was sort of a tribute to the fire god, actually means it's a reference to conquering another city and burning down the temple to their god, which is essentially how you won a war. Then everyone sort of went home. There wasn't enough of a population density to just massacre and enslave everybody. But I mean, yeah, we found pretty much the same thing with Native American Indians, at least when I was looking. I mean, obviously Elizabeth looked at a deeper level, but I'd actually follow that up with a question like, why is there this insistence on something that seems so counterintuitive? Like before human societies disciplined male violence or male and female sexuality or just warfare in general, that there would be less violence. Like, why would anyone think that? Is it just part of the general narrative of humans were sweet, wonderful fruit eaters and then we were corrupted by capitalism? Or where does the idea come from?
I think that it does come from this kind of, um, decolonization movement. We were pretty much all peaceful until the colonizers came, and now we have to decolonize and bring back the peace. And you mentioned matriarchy, which is quite interesting because you, more so than the argument about peace, you get the argument about, oh, we were always a matriarchy. We were always a matriarchy. And there's very little evidence of that. Actually, many tribes, upon contact with Europeans, the Europeans were like, oh, these Native Americans have all these wives. And actually, it wasn't that they had all these wives. It was that they had all these female slaves. I mean, I think that some anthropologists have confused the term matrilineal with matriarchy. And so they're now saying, oh, we were always matriarchal, but they might have just been matrilineal, which makes more sense because matrilineal is more often when it, the case when you don't know whose the father is, right? So you follow the line then through the mother, which makes sense. But that doesn't mean that the women had the power. And this is a really strange narrative. And then on the flip side, this very contradictory type of um, acquiescing to Native American demands that women who are menstruating stay away from artifacts, stay away from eat in a different room in field schools, eat in a different cabin in field schools, and don't and that women shouldn't be touching certain artifacts. There's was even a case where some tribes wanted literally to have the data from artifacts and bones be kept in two different data sets, not even on the same computer, because one set wasn't supposed to be seen by women. And this is, how is that matriarchal? And then they'll make these weird claims like, well, the reason is because, women, when they're menstruating, they are so powerful that they have to stay away. No, it's because they've been considered filthy and they don't want them near their food. This is a very different narrative. And yet we see some of the most quote unquote progressive places buying into this, field schools that collaborate with Native Americans that are with it coming out of UC Berkeley with collaboration of Native Americans engage in these unbelievable sexist things.
Right.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good summary, and I think that's part of a larger and more fascinating trend, actually, which is where kind of the woke narrative of anyone who's currently underperforming must be a victim is taken out of the context where it began, which is sort of like the American Jim Crow South with Murdoch and all that stuff, and applied in situations where it just makes no sense at all, like the Jews and the Arabs fighting in the Middle East where like
Yeah.
whoever's currently winning the war is the bad guy because winning is bad. And if you're looking at this as just an intelligent observer, there's no logic there whatsoever, but you see it a lot. And I guess in terms of what you just said, the frame that I can see like a feminist sparring partner going with would be, well, we know these people are oppressed because they're not white, so the whites must be oppressing them. So even if they're doing incredibly abusive stuff to women, that must be either one, a result of white colonization, or B, a tradition so deep that I, as a white oppressor, just don't
Yeah,
understand
who are
it.
we to
We,
judge?
yeah,
Yes.
but yeah, we've got to go along with it. And like for me, I wouldn't describe myself as brilliantly traveled or something, but I've lived in Latin America, albeit briefly. I have a lot of friends from the Middle East and the business side of the work I do. And in reality, these are equally civilized, powerful societies that often believe things that are by our standards evil. So like Arabs and Chinese think it's a joke to see these Westerners from what they consider our mayfly society saying, oh, well, we can't criticize in a foot binding or whatever. We held you down during the 1840 Opium War. So this is considered to be an insane pathology by our equal enemies, but it's something that we do over here. And I mean,
Right.
the last comment, I think this would explain a lot of the attitudes toward Islam as well, where like the same people that'll adamantly refuse to like cook at home because it's a traditional women's role will say things like hijab, that's a lady's choice, because now you're bringing in another culture.
Mhm.
Yes.
Interestingly, like last thing, but interestingly, like feminist partners that I've had were always a little confused about what to do, because every time they would invoke the oppression of women, I, who have a sense of humor, would just point out that I'm Black and Native American. So actually, they should do whatever I say because I am the more victimized person. And because I'm actually not an abuser, you just then go from there back to like we're both equal. But the point that anyone could do this, and it's silly to apply it only to foreign societies, is worth keeping in mind. I don't know that
That's
about
true.
Native chiefs, that they were still following the old menstruating women live in a separate lodge kind of stuff. But
Right.
seeing Berkeley co-eds go along with that would be apex hilarious
That
until
would
you
be,
told the
yeah.
native tribe to stop.
So, yeah. So Elizabeth, can we get to the NAGPRA, and you can
Sure.
talk briefly about your problems with that law, both the California more stringent one and the repatriation of the Native American graves.
Yes. So basically, NAGPRA is a federal one, the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and it calls for the repatriation, which is the giving back of skeletal remains and sacred objects and funerary objects to connected modern tribes, connected to the a site to modern tribes. And although I've said this many times, I am against any return of bones. I just the other day there was a big reburial of German bones from a site in Berlin, and I'm against that. Um, but if you're gonna do repatriation, the thing about NAGPRA was about making it a compromise to ensure that science still can go forward and that the people who have a true connection with the collection can repatriate the bones. So that was a compromise. That compromise has fallen apart because of various regulations that have been put in place. For example, they have now removed the term culturally unidentifiable. Sometimes you can't determine what tribe this collection belonged to. And then sometimes the collection doesn't belong to any existing tribe,
So what do they do
right?
in that case? Does somebody just come along and say, well, I say it's mine, and that's what happens?
Yeah, basically what they do in that case is they say, well, who's here now? What tribe is here
Who
now?
feels like it's theirs?
Yes.
Yeah, well, the obvious
And
problem with that, of course, as both of you guys would say more eloquently than me, is again that these people fought as often as anyone else. So it's pretty absurd to go to the native tribe that lives in Berkeley right now. I'm just making the city up, which is probably about half Mexican American, and say, well, you guys are the inheritors of 10,000 years of native bones. I'm not sure what I would do if I was the son of the chief or whatever.
well, I can tell
Probably
you what,
keep them in museums and demand money. Honestly, that would be my response. But I'm sure the native responses vary all across the map. But there's very little proof, I would imagine, that most of these people are actually the descendants of the original tribe represented in the skeletal collections as versus its worst enemy or
Well,
something.
I'm sure there's an oral
yes.
tradition somewhere.
There's
Well,
There
yes,
could
that's
be.
the thing. I would
they
imagine.
basically
I didn't read
base
this part of the book in detail, but I would imagine that what you probably do is listen to a bunch of native legends and decide which one you like. Is that correct, actually?
Yes, I would say
No.
it's basically based on oral myth. I think oral history is is a story that is told that can be backed up by, you know, historic documents and so forth, right? So they told it to somebody and somebody wrote it down. But oral myth includes things like creation stories and mythology, and that's what they're using now to make these decisions.
Oh, my favorite
And
one from your book. We've always been here.
we've always been here. Yes. And
We
it's
didn't
kind of
migrate.
in
We
It's
came up
really
through the
amazing to
soil
think of
like plants.
politicians making decisions based on this level of stuff. And by the way, when I mentioned the Israeli Arab conflict, you see both sides saying the same type of thing. I mean, I'm pro Israel, but like, obviously, according to the oral stories that preceded the Bible, the ancestors of Ishmael. And I mean, if I were a lawyer in the UN, I would toss all of this out immediately. And then we'd talk about like rational claims today, what happened just after Balfour and so on. But with natives, it sounds, without mocking, even more nonsensical.
It
Where
is
if you
nonsensical. And
can
the
you give
other reason is they basically argue that each tribe was created separately, so that there's no link to different tribes and this kind of thing. And that's why they can say, oh, this collection belongs to our tribe. There's a lot of intertribal warfare, I must say, in repatriation
Who
decisions.
gets who gets
oh,
cut?
how
Can I
how
ask a real
historically
naive
appropriate.
question? I want to ask you quickly. So we've established that studying the bones is important, and now we got this law and this big push, and the culture's moving one way. How would anybody ever excavate now going forward? I mean, like, how would you ever get another Ryan Mound?
You know, quite honestly, you won't. The only time you will get anything like that now in the US is if there's a construction
When you're building
site
a
and
skyscraper.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And almost all of the collections in the US are what we call salvage sites, sites that were
Mhm.
discovered that way, because almost every other collection has been reburied. And but the other thing is, like, in a sense, with NAGPRA, with California's version of NAGPRA, so NAGPRA said we have to take all the evidence into account, the biological, the anthropological, the historic, and the oral myths or oral history, and we throw them all together and see what the best links are. But NAGPRA says if there's a disagreement between the science and the oral history or the Native American story, then you must accept the Native American story over the science. And that's what makes California's law worse than the federal law. And California has gone further and said that there will be no um, use of Native American remains in teaching collections. And if you know anything about teaching collections are a hodgepodge of bones that grow, accumulate over decades from donations, from excavations that weren't well documented in the 50s and 60s, 40s, whatever. Um, and everything in between the East, the Indian, as in East India, the East Indian collections that were from the bone trade. And what they're going to do is if there is a possibility that there's a remain there in that teaching collection that is Native American, they will take out the whole teaching collection because there's no way to determine whether this bone fragment is Native American or not. You can say, well, we're just going to assume it is, and we're going to remove the teaching collection. And that's what we're seeing happening right now. We're seeing in certain universities, they're even banning the use of photographs, slides. Professors cannot use their slides anymore to teach these topics. So it's not only the bones themselves, but now it's the images of them.
Well, speaking of the native thing, real quick, the one thing story I liked in your book that was interesting is that you talk about oral myth and people making up things and where does this belong? Can you talk about how San Jose State University claimed to have 700 Native American students, but we couldn't find them?
Oh, can you repeat that? Sorry, you froze a little bit.
Oh, the 700 Native American students that the school supposedly had
Oh, yes.
that you couldn't find.
So basically, they couldn't find. So San Jose State decided they wanted to hire a scholar of Native American studies. And in their ad to do so, they said that there were 700 Native American students at basically saying, we have a large group of Native American students, is 700 or 750. And so when I saw this number, I said, wow, that's a lot. That's like more than, that would put us in the top 3 or 4, right? Maybe Oklahoma, Alaska, Arizona, and then San Jose. And I was like,
Right.
that just doesn't seem right. And our department, the anthropology department, housed the Native American Studies minor. And we actually would have maybe 1 student or 2 students in this minor in 5 years. So I looked at the university research, that demographics, and I found that the number was more like 20. And that they are self-identified. So even there, it's, maybe even less, but about 20. Some years a little less, some years a little more. And when I reached out and asked about where the 750 came from, I got the runaround. Some people said, well, they said, well, we count it differently depending on basically what the purpose is, what money they're looking for. So when they're filing for money for being a Hispanic based, a high serving Hispanic university, then all those Native Americans are counted as Hispanic. But if they want to find,
there's 100,000 students at this school.
And so
That's really funny.
they putting like students in different categories depending on where they want to get the money. And there's just no evidence that there are 700 Native American students at San Jose. And they basically did this to try to get more money for this Native American Studies department hire and so forth.
No.
Really hilarious thing about this is in like suburban San Jose, I would estimate that probably all these people are either just white or they're Caucasian Hispanics. I mean,
Hispanic, right.
this is like Ibram. The one piece of good quantitative research my boy Ibram Kendi ever did, not used in a derogatory term, way against African American males. But anyway, like
Disclaimer.
but the guy did a good piece where he looked at the percentage of students. This was published in The Hill, and I think he's going to journal it. But he found that looking at the number of students that were suddenly Native American, it was like 5.7% of all students or something like that. And then the number of people that suddenly were Hispanic, but like white identifying Hispanics, he came to the conclusion, and I don't want to misstate his research, but like 33% of whites had to just be lying on their college applications and saying these were minorities. And you can still look this up, like Kendi, third of all whites lying. And I looked through the numbers and I was like, yeah, that's probably true. That's really interesting. But Ibram Kendi then realized that this would destroy his primary claim, which is that there's a massive disadvantage to being a minority.
I was just going to ask you, why would anybody want to be in the
you can still find it like in the magazines, but take it down off Twitter, Facebook, whatever. But I mean, I would imagine that that's probably true in the California collegiate system, where like a great number of Native Americans would be like blonde-haired girls with beads in their hair and so on. I like no real hate for them getting over on a corrupt system, but I don't really know how many American Indians I've seen wandering around any college campus where I've given a lecture. And I mean, you know kind of what a Native American Indian looks like. Not many.
Why would anybody want to pretend to be a part of an oppressed group, Will?
Well, because now it's actually interesting because one of the things I get accused of is being an affirmative action beneficiary, and I actually teach at one of the better black colleges where it would have been an advantage to be a white guy. So I'm in that weird group where like they say we're like, oh, an upper middle class black man, we got plenty of them. So I don't really know how much I've benefited, but like looking at the boosts nationally, I mean, we all know the answer, but because there's 150 SAT point boost at least applying to colleges, just a regular Black or Hispanic, much less there's an exotic member of the, newly discovered tribe residing in the mall of SoCal or whatever, you know.
And in
Push these
2020,
kids.
it was 98% of the corporate hires.
Yeah.
Well, that actually, like, so much of this on both sides is just bad stats. Like, what they did was just compare the number of people that got new jobs versus it was something like it was the number of jobs that were applied that the number of people that got new jobs
Right.
versus the number of available job opportunities or something like that.
Right.
What they forgot to look at was the fact that there were many people that were refilling or newly filling jobs that had been abandoned by COVID. So, like, if you actually put the numbers in Stata and crunch them professionally, it was like 46% of the people hired were just whites, mostly males.
Right.
I mean, even that does apply a little reverse racism because 61% of Americans are white. It's 78% if you're counting all white Hispanics, which is another thing that's just ignored
And
when we
those
look at this
Native
stuff.
Americans that sounds extinct.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a level of back and forth BS that it's really hard to figure out what's going on. So, like, yes,
And
of course, there's reverse.
Maybe we
a
should just
lot of
stop
people,
prioritizing it.
I mean, like, we have some really famous cases of pretendians, like
Oh yeah,
Sacheen Littlefeather, right? She's actually was Mexican American. But then we have the Mexicans who pretend who are actually not Mexican. And Linda Ronstadt, I she's German. Her family's German. And basically, yeah, she had the album that where she sings in Spanish, Canciones de mi Padre. Her father spoke Spanish because he worked on he was a rancher. She never learned any Spanish. She just memorized the songs. If I'm not wrong, one of her siblings is name, one of her brother's name is Dieter, and another one's Walter. I mean, Ronstadt is a German name. Linda is even a German name. People are like, oh no, Linda is Hispanic for pretty. Yes, but that doesn't mean that that name comes from that. Linda is actually an ancient German name. So, but she has been passing herself off as Mexican for years.
No, no soy fluente, pero yo sé hablar español bastante bueno por americano, pero soy negro y irlandés, no mexicano. I mean, like, a lot of people speak Spanish because you learn it in business. I can speak Mandarin Chinese to about an 8th grade level. Doesn't mean I'm from Shanghai. I mean, so
Yeah.
you see the back and forth debate here with where half of the minorities are just whites. As a black business person, this is something I find funny but a bit annoying.
But
Where you
imagine
now
where
have
it's going to
people.
go as we go further in this. So as we talk about, you can identify how you want and how we changed the Civil Rights Act to amend for identity. So not even whether you're trans, you can have that argument, but you're trans, you're going through surgery, you're doing this, you're going to I'm not living as. You can just say, I identify as. And
Not to
race is going
interrupt
to be right behind that.
Not to interrupt either of you guys, by the way, but the funniest pretend minority was Jessica Krug, who was a suburban white academic who began to identify herself as a Puerto Rican nationalist called Jess La Bambalera. Um, I just pulled up some of these cases because I wrote an article about this once. Cover girl on Vanity Fair in 2020, but I just recommend that for anyone that wants a really funny story.
Right.
And
And
like
Elizabeth has some
leave home for
academics in the
college.
book that did it as well.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
there's some great cases in the book, which everyone should read.
There you go.
On
Thanks. Somebody
Warpath.
hold it up. There you go.
Yeah.
So,
But
so as we leave this, Elizabeth, what do you want people to take from this? Learn what can we do? How bad is it? Should we all just quit and just
give up,
what
really.
do we
That's the
do?
thing.
Well,
Surrender.
depending on what side of the bed I wake up, I have a different opinion about where this all is going. Anthropology, unfortunately, is very deep down in the trenches in the whole woke culture. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get out of it. I hope we are, because I think anthropology is such a fascinating and important field. But the other aspect of anthropology which makes it difficult, is that you actually need the bones. You need
That's
to
true.
have the data, the bones to do the research. And therefore, once those bones are buried, there's no moving forward in a way. And so, in one way, you can have great universities starting up, like in Austin, that fight back against this woke culture. But how is it going to deal with these kinds of things where you have fields that need real resources that are being taken away by this culture? And so I don't know if anthropology is going to recover. It's spread far beyond just the Native Americans now. We have, as I mentioned earlier, there was a
German.
big burial of Berlin remains. There's the from the Samuel Morton collection in Pennsylvania, they took the African skulls and they repatriated them to Cuba, which is where they were enslaved because they couldn't figure out where from Africa they were. What? Well, I mean, if I would even believe in a concept of soul or past life or anything like that, the last place I would want to be returned to is where I was enslaved. That just does not seem to make sense to me. And so we have these absurdities, and I just cannot see how anthropology can climb out of this. I hope that those reading my book will see that anthropology, the importance of anthropology, but also the connection to the other issues of cancel culture, and therefore maybe, fight back against these kinds of actions.
All right. Well, thank you. She is Elizabeth Weiss, author, physical anthropologist, and author of On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors, and Pocahontas, too. I like that one, so let's not forget Pocahontas. Elizabeth, it's been great speaking with you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.